What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an update on Banquet for Fools, an upcoming crpg that is currently in early access and more specifically got a few major updates since the last time I talked about it all the way in October of 2024, and obviously I wanted to go through that and update people on what the game's got going on nowadays. Now, if you've never heard of Banquet for Fools, it's an isometric real-time with pause RPG made by an indie team behind the title Serpent and the Staglands. In fact, this takes place within that universe they've already built, and I would describe it as kind of wonderfully strange. In particular, though, I've always really liked the art style of this one. It's very eye-catching. But the long and short of it is, we take on the role of a party of 4 heroes who are tasked with getting to the bottom of a disappearance of an entire village, set on the island of Invamona. This island is notorious for being the only place you can grow this special spice that is obviously very lucrative. And as such, there's a lot of competition for it, so when an entire village goes missing, that is likely going to lead to other stuff. Now, for the sake of early access, the game has largely been feature complete for some time. What they're really working on here, primarily, is balancing, of course, everything that is here, but also getting the actual content in order, which is why over the past, I think, 7 or so months since release into early access, they've primarily been focusing on adding individual maps that you can then explore and do content within. That is to say, various side quests, new questing hubs, that kind of thing. Now, an interesting thing about this game, though, if you do decide to check it out, is that it's the type of game that requires you to keep a sort of in-game journal of your own. If you have a conversation and are given tasks, etc., you've got to keep up with those, you've got to write them down or remember them, and you're largely free to explore however you please as far as your own skills can take you, or more specifically, your party's skills can take you, with the ability to do things like lockpick, multiple quest outcomes, etc. With that in mind, let's actually get into some of the changes that have taken place here. Now, I'm not going to go over every single little thing, because if you are unaware, they have been prolific in updating this game, like several times a day in some instances, which means there's a ton of tiny little patches that are focused on fixing very specific little bugs they've found, and there's honestly a pretty innumerable amount of bugs that have been fixed since this game is launched and things they've been taking a look at and adjusting. And again, I'm simply not going to go over all of those, but to focus on some of the biggest stuff, straight away shortly after the game released, they focused on adding a bunch of support for varying resolutions and some quality of life stuff, like for instance the ability to just stack items within your own inventory, camping out in the wilderness with blankets to sort of heal and rest as you go, and even just showing some calculations of how you're rolling everything behind the scenes in the dialogue boxes, that kind of stuff. Now, in the earlier updates, there were 2 important things I wanted to focus on, though, which are directional attacks, meaning that the angle from which you hit an enemy that you are fighting does have different effects. Like, for instance, if you hit an enemy in the back, you deal extra damage versus the side, etc. Meaning that positioning is a bit important here. But the other thing is team tactics, so to speak. So we are in charge of a party of 4, and we can individually control each one of them, yes, but you can also go in and set various tactics for each one to kind of give them a general approach to combat and how often they'll use things like healing items, etc. So a lot of good, important changes, but the big stuff started happening around patch 1.3, which is stuff like rebalancing a lot of the stats, especially with how they scale with various weapons. As an example, they adjusted what stats a weapon would calculate its hit chance off of, for instance, strength or dexterity as an example. So 1.3 included just a lot of combat balancing in regards to stats and changes to how a lot of that stuff was calculated for individual weapon types. And this means that there was definitely some changes in how damage worked and functioned there. And at least on the sort of player end of things, I would say it mostly just feels more consistent now in terms of the damage you would get, as well as your chance to actually hit something. This is also about the time that they added the ability to actually pick up armor off of any humanoid enemies that you kill who had armor. But realistically, patch 1.5 is when I think they started dropping the larger updates, that is to say new areas to explore, because 1.5 added dryads in the Spore Forest area, which effectively means more quests and NPCs to interact with, and thus more content to undertake. So simply by default, patch 1.5 was pretty big, but 1.8, fairly recently, back in April I believe actually, is probably the single most substantial update for me personally, and that is because this is the one that added a whole bunch of team and enemy tactics that you could mess around with. As an example, some enemies have actual armor on them, and then others have sort of breakable natural armor like chitin. And the more you hit enemies with individual weapon types, it will kind of vary depending on what weapon you're using, with two-handed weapons generally being better at it, but your hits will degrade that armor over time, allowing you to deal more consistent damage to enemies the longer a fight goes on and the more you hit them. However, this is sort of counterbalanced with things like evasion. You see, each enemy you're fighting has a sort of fatigue behind the scenes where the more they do and the more they get hit, etc., they will get tired and deal less damage and be less able to get out of the way of your actual attacks. Now, they can recover this though, which is where enemy tactics come in. Enemies can form up into squads to do things like just defend against you, try to recover health or their fatigue more quickly, or simply doing things like swarming you, the player. Now, on the player side of these things, you can actually perform actions like a form up yourself if you aren't satisfied with just purely using things like the sort of team tactics AI system. But then, most recently, to sort of start closing this one out, with the 2.0 update, we got access to 2 new areas on the map to explore, including Razafir and Lazur Falls, which themselves, of course, come with new content, sights to see, etc. And in the case of these 2 areas, actually adds more ability to learn spells, which comes in the form of the Vol tree, in particular allowing you to learn how to summon some more creatures via spells, but also even some quality of life stuff like allowing your party to move faster outside of combat. But that's hardly everything, because looking to the future already, they're already planning the release of more map area, basically allowing you to do and see more as they continue to expand and work on the content of the game, with 3.0 being planned as soon as, I believe, like the end of May, give or take, so they're moving at a pretty quick pace in that regard. That said, for today and this video, that's pretty much everything I had to show you guys. Just kind of wanted to keep people appraised of this one, because I think it's coming along really well and looks to be something pretty cool, and I'm excited to play it when it's actually finished. But that's pretty much it for now, so hopefully you enjoyed all that. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.